appreciate the invitation for being here. And I also want to say I appreciate all of you for turning on your cameras, because I feel reassured when I can see faces. And so thank you for doing that. I'll say just a little bit about myself, and then I have about a 30-minute presentation. But as you may know, I'm a professor here at Miami University. I'm in women's gender and sexuality studies. I'm also the director of the linguistics program here. I teach courses in women's studies, in African literature, and linguistics. So in my research, I specialize in African American women's oral narratives. And so I'm going to be sharing with you some general ideas about African American women's history and their thoughts and words. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to hope that the technology works. And let's see what happens. So it says the host disabled screen sharing.
Oh, I will go ahead and fix that really quick.
Okay.
Let me see. All right, you should have the ability to do so now.
Yes.
Perfect.
I do. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about intersectionality. I'm going to talk about some myths that we needed to discuss with regard to women and women's history. And I'm going to talk about this idea of restorative history. You know, my work primarily focuses on African American women who were born and had careers before the 1950s. So I always like to begin by acknowledging our ancestors. And by our ancestors, I mean all of us. Whether you are from royalty or from everyday people, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that those who have gone before us made it possible for us to be here in this place at this day, at this time. So having said that, I will move on. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is witnessing and testifying. And you may hear that a lot in the context of African American traditions of storytelling and narrating narrating their lives. And by bearing witness, I mean to show that something exists or is true. Bearing witness also means it's a way to express experience. It's a way to validate or acknowledge events or experiences. And it is a way to offer evidence of our lived experiences. So some of the women that I have in the slide are women who in various ways have made testimonies or have been bearing witness to their lives and experiences. So I'm going to talk a lot about stories and storytelling throughout this brief presentation. And I think it's important to understand that stories and storytelling, according to the academic world, is often relegated to folklore, to something that's unscientific. But we all know that all cultures depend on stories, and all cultures have multiple uses for stories. And so the fact that academics tend to overlook stories does not diminish their value in our lives and in our works. So here are some ideas about stories. While story means so much in every culture and ethnicity, I know that Black folk, no matter how they got here, are planted in story and shared lived experience. It's the way we witness. As Congressman John Lewis says, The movement without storytelling is like birds without wings. Or from Kimberly Crenshaw, who, as you may know, is the attorney, scholar who is credited for coining the term intersectionality. And I will talk about that more later. Kimberly Crenshaw says, "We must begin to tell Black women's stories because without them, we cannot tell the story of Black men, white women, or anyone else in this country. The story of Black women is critical because those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it." So having said that and established the importance of story, I want to move on to specific stories. These are classic texts that you may have heard of, you may not have heard of, but nonetheless, these are examples that I use to illustrate Black women's historical and traditional storytelling or witnessing, that is, offering testimonies of their lives and lived experiences. So the first one is Homespun Heroines and Other Women of Distinction by Hallie Quinn Brown. This is a collection of brief biographies of women who lived women who were born in Canada or the US between the 1970s and the end of the 19th century. This collection of narratives and biographies was published in 1926. And it's so interesting, if you take the time to look through these biographies, you find such a variety of Black women. You find Black women who were enslaved. You find those who were social workers, who were artists, who were homemakers, who were activists, who were cake makers. And these biographies give to us, the general public, a sense of understanding of women's lives, of Black women's lives at that particular point in time. Another witnessing or testimony that I'd like to share with you is by Annie Burton. It is believed that she was born in 1858, but the date of her death is unknown. She was enslaved on a plantation outside of Clayton, Alabama, and eventually earned her freedom. And throughout her life, she was always seeking education. So she learned to read and write. And later in her adult life, she went back to school. And in those days, it was called night school. She enrolled in the Franklin Evening School. And one of the assignments for a class that she took at the Franklin Evening School was to write a story about her life. In other words, all of the students were asked to write their autobiographies. So Annie L. Burton's Memories of Childhood Slavery Days was the result of a class project. And it was very interesting because she talked about her life under slavery, as well as the impact of emancipation on her life. I also want to mention Harriet E. Wilson's Our Nig, Sketches from the Life of a Free Black. Now, Harriet Wilson was discovered to be the first African American to publish a novel in North America. Her novel initially it was published anonymously, and it was thought to be written by a white writer. And it eventually sunk into obscurity. But then Henry Louis Gates, a literary scholar, if you may have heard of him and know about him, an African-American literary scholar, rediscovered this novel and with his team verified that it was indeed written by an African-American. He republished this novel in 1983. And finally, I thought it was very timely to mention briefly Elizabeth Keckley's uh, novel, narrative, entitled Behind the Scenes, 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. And Mrs. Keckley has an interesting story. I won't have time to share all of it, but she was, as the title indicates, was enslaved, eventually learned the skills to be a seamstress and worked to earn her freedom. And she did by using her skills as a seamstress. She wanted to buy her freedom as well as the freedom of her son. She did that and eventually established her own business as a seamstress. Her clients were wealthy, well-to-do women in the Washington, D.C. area. She eventually became the seamstress for Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of Abraham Lincoln. And after the assassination of President Lincoln, Keckley became closer to Mrs. Lincoln. And as Mrs. Lincoln experienced financial difficulties, Elizabeth Keckley decided to publish Behind the Scenes, which is an account of her life, as well as information about the inner workings of the White House under President and Mary Todd Lincoln's time there. She did this in order to earn money, and she used that money she contributed that to Mrs. Lincoln's upkeep. The interesting thing about this is that Behind the Scenes received harsh criticism. People thought that Keckley should not reveal information about the intimacies of the White House behind the scenes, as the title suggests. So ultimately, the harsh criticism drove Elizabeth Keckley out of business, ended her career as a seamstress, and unfortunately, she passed away in an institution for the homeless and destitute. We could talk about the implications of this for days, but I will leave that for now and move on. I just wanted to offer these novels to you, these narratives to you, as examples of how Black women testify or bear witness to their own life stories. I want to move on to the myth of the exceptional woman, which applies in many respects to African American women. I thought it would be a good idea to look first at a dictionary definition of exceptional. And here's the definition, 3 definitions: exception, exceptional, meaning rare. Or the second definition, better than average or superior. Or number 3, deviating from the norm. And look at the synonyms for exceptional: aberrant, aberrated, abnormal, anomalous, atypical, especial, exceeding, extraordinary, extraordinary, freak, odd, peculiar, phenomenal, preternatural, rare, singular, uncommon, uncustomary, unique, unusual, unwanted. And I ask us to look at these definitions of exceptional because there is this belief that when women, whether they are Black or white, cross the barrier into a field or an area previously occupied by white men exclusively, the belief is that this is the only woman, this is the one woman who could do it. But we know, if we look widely at women's history, that this is indeed not the case. So the example that I have to share with you is that of Rosa Parks. We tend to regard Rosa Parks as the first and only woman to give up her seat, to refuse to give up her seat on the bus. But before Rosa Parks, there were many women, or several women. For example, Claudette Colvin before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. She was only 15 at the time, and she was taken off the bus, beaten, and arrested for disorderly conduct. There were also other women, such as Aurelia Broader, Viola White, Geneva Johnson, Katie Wingfield, Susan McDonald, Epsie Worthy, Mary Louise Smith Ware. And again, these are all women who demonstrate that the myth of the exceptional woman is just that, a myth. Okay, let's see. All right, so next I want to talk about intersectionality. And if any of you, as you may know, if you've taken women's studies courses, it is a term that has gained a lot of momentum in both the community and in academic life. On the one hand, intersectionality is very simply a web of interconnected relationships between different forms of oppression. It is also, as explained by Kimberly Crenshaw, basically a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from equality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts. I often use myself as an example, and that is, I can't wake up tomorrow and say, oh, today I'm just going to be a woman. Or wake up tomorrow and say, oh, I'm just going to be Black today. Because for my lived experiences, I am all of these things at the same time. And the world reacts to me in that way. So I'd like to play a brief clip for you of Kimberly Crenshaw explaining a bit more what she means by intersectionality.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit, it is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
And I would also like to point you to Kimberly Crenshaw's TED Talk called The Urgency of Intersectionality. And in this talk, she talks about the hashtag Say Her Name movement, which I will talk a bit about a little later. So another example of intersectionality that I'd like to share with you is this classic text that was published in 1982. And the title of it is All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women Studies. And the editors of this text published this book because in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, Black studies programs and women's studies programs were being initiated and flourishing in universities. But what turned out to be the case is that Black studies programs tended to focus on men, and the women's studies programs tended to focus on white women. So these scholars came up with this wonderful title as a way to call attention to what we now know as the intersectional lived experiences of Black women. And here are some of their ideas from this book. The opportunities for Black women to carry out anonymously defined investigations of, to carry out autonomously defined investigations of self in a society which, through racial, sexual, and class oppression, systematically denies our existence, have been, by definition, limited. And they also say, what our multi-layered oppression does not explain are the ways in which we have created and maintained our own intellectual traditions as Black women. So going back to those earlier texts that I shared with you, Homespun Heroines, Memories of Childhood Slavery Days, Our Nig, Behind the Scenes, are all examples of how Black women created their own intellectual traditions without waiting for anyone to acknowledge them. Now, there's a flip side to this whole notion of intersectionality, and that is intersectional invisibility, which is described this way. Intersectional invisibility provides a framework for understanding how Black women who live at the intersection of racism and sexism may be harmed when their unique experiences as Black women are not recognized. So here's an example, a couple of examples. Hidden Figures. And I was so excited to see this book and later the movie come out in 2016. Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Dorothy Bond were the mathematicians whose lives were reflected in Hidden Figures. But because they were standing at the crossroads of sexism and racism, and also in a primarily white male field, aerospace engineering, they were overlooked. So this book helped us understand that this term, this situation that we cause intersectional invisibility. Another example I think of is Gladys West, who was a mathematician who made significant contributions to the development of the GPS. Again, overlooked. Again, a part of that intersectional invisibility. And finally, a historical example. I'm sure many of you have heard of Marcus Garvey, but how many of you knew about Mittie M.L. Gordon? During the 1930s, the Chicago-based activist Mittie Maud Lena Garden promoted Back to Africa under the auspices of her organization, the Peace Movement of Ethiopia, the largest Black nationalist organization established by a woman in the country. Founded in 1932, the PME drew an estimated 300,000 supporters, primarily members of the Black working class, in more than a dozen cities across the nation. The organization's rapid growth during the 1930s and 1940s, as well as its wide reach, was directly tied to Gordon's skills as a public speaker. Gordon, like Garvey, used city parks and street corners as platforms to disseminate her political ideas and build momentum for the movement. These are just a few of the examples of what is considered intersectional invisibility. And finally, I'd like to talk about a broader idea that is considered restorative history. Now, this term restorative history has not yet been validated by the Academy. It is a term that was created, coined by M. Campbell Yon, a writer. And I also have to say to you that I'm not a historian, I'm a linguist, but like Yon, I am very interested in history. So this is how Yon describes restorative history. She says, as a result of too many of these re-centralized bodies of knowledge, Black histories, women's history, multicultural studies have become ghettoized. They are still not considered the history, but rather subsidiary histories to the primary history of the colonizer. In schools, they are elective instead of required courses. In reality, they have been pushed back to the margins. And so, in developing restorative history, I am attempting to confront and completely dismantle the frameworks that have made the colonizer's history the primary history. So if we examine restorative history as a concept, it includes at least three processes. One, to decolonize. That is to eliminate the Western dominance of various academic fields and ways of thinking. It also seeks to decenter the focus on Western thoughts and theories. And lastly, to restore marginalized voices. So decolonizing history includes these ideas. Here are some thoughts about that. This from H. Elsie Austin, an attorney and scholar. She said, in some future age, when history is no longer written to advance the prestige and power of particular groups and nations, perhaps historians will be able to state frankly how much of the tragedy and chaos of our world has been due to the effects of women and to the efforts of women and men who distorted civilization and humanity by deliberately provoking animosity and division over the outward differences of men. And this from Sue Lynn Lewis, a historian. She says the process of decolonizing history is broadly about making historians aware and committed to addressing the disproportionate focus on Eurocentric history in the profession and attuned to the structures of power underlying this. The study of decolonization rests on understanding imperial power and its implication in structures of racial discrimination, as well as the processes of disentangling colonized societies from economic, political, social, cultural, and psychological damage of imperial rule. And I want to say too, that this is not just about history, it's about other fields as well. Since the late 1970s and early 1980s, scholars from many different fields have called for decolonizing their field. We are talking about anthropology, literature, women's studies, and other fields that seek to decenter the Western view and to restore marginalized voices. Finally, we must also talk about decolonizing knowledge. That's, a kind of even a broader concept. And so here are some ideas about that. There are many aspects of Western thinking which have been exalted to a status of unassailable principle in the general mind, that time may well show to have been erroneous, or at least only partially true. This is from a 1983 letter on behalf of the Universal House of Justice of the Baha'is of the world. And from Margaret Kovac, an indigenous scholar. While colonization came to affect every aspect of indigenous life, Western science in particular has worked to first subjugate and then discredit indigenous knowledge systems and the people themselves. And this work, this process that impacted indigenous people also had an impact on marginalized people. So when we bring in feminist points of view and look at knowledge, here are some last thoughts on that. This is from Sepodi's Misbehave, published in 2017. She's an African scholar, activist, and feminist that is well worth reading. She says, to misbehave is to denounce the social norms that limit individuals based on who they are. To make history is to upset patriarchy, a system that is intent on controlling and marginalizing others. And from Patricia Hill Collins, a Black feminist scholar that we quote very frequently. She says, as social conditions change, so must the knowledge and practices designed to resist them. So all of this is about changing the way we produce knowledge, changing the way we value knowledge, and changing the way we apply knowledge to our lives and to our work. I conclude here with just a brief clip from Beyonce's Run the World Girls as a way to look at how modern day feminists envision women and their impact and their potential and their power.
Dr. Etter-Lewis, we are not seeing anything on our screen from a video if you're showing one.
So I close with this thought. And that is to go back to the idea of saying her name. And this is, as you may know, hashtag Say Her Name is a social movement that to raise awareness on Black female victims of police and anti-Black violence. It is also a way to honor and recognize and uphold women and acknowledge their lives and their contributions, and to remember them, whether they are currently living or not. It is important that we learn from them and understand their lives. This is a poem by Nikita Oliver. She says, "My sister, we remember you, seeing how they gather the trails of your stardust. I want us to say your name and remember." Thank you.
Dr. Etter-Lewis, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. I know I wish we could have applause. Do you have time? I personally am burning with a couple questions. Do you have time to take a few?
Sure.
I'll let, if anybody else has any, I'll let you guys jump in before I get into mine. If anybody wanted to ask some. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead then. So this semester, you mentioned a few texts throughout the presentation that I've already jotted down, but this semester and throughout, well, really, I'm hoping that it's going to be an ongoing thing, but we are doing a D&I-centered book club, and I was wondering that if you might have any recommendations as to texts that you think would be great for us to read.
Oh my gosh, you don't have time for that, but yes, I would, and I can also send you a list too of some, and I won't overwhelm you with all of these ideas, but one text that I would suggest is an older text, but it's a classic text called Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, who is an African-American science fiction writer. She wrote Kindred. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to read Kindred, but some people say that Parable of the Sower is regaining more popularity now because it speaks to some of the issues that we're dealing with in our lives today. And so that's one. Another one is Misbehave that I mentioned in my presentation. Another one is Hood Feminism, Hood Feminism, which came out, I think, in 2020, 2019, which is a different look at Black feminism in particular and feminism in general. And, you know, the author talks about how feminism has to meet the needs of all women. So those are just a few, and I have a couple of others that I can email to you.
I would love that. That would be awesome. We're reading one book this semester, one next semester, and one over the summer, but I'm always happy to add to the reading list and hopefully build one for the chapter as well.
What are you reading this semester?
We are reading How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibn Kendi.
Yes.
I've read it already, and I'm so excited to be sharing it with the chapter. I think it's a fantastic way to kind of, you know, begin centering yourself in activist narratives and kind of get the jumping off point. And
great choice.
Thank you. It was, I have a committee of 3 girls who helped me to pick it. So I'm very fortunate to be able to work with them. And then I just had another question. You mentioned earlier the myth of the exceptional woman. And I was wondering, I've been hearing so much discourse lately about, especially with the rise of anti-Asian, just, I guess, conversation and crimes that we've seen in the country. If you're familiar with the myth of the model minority, and kind of how that plays, or I guess intersects with the exceptional woman.
Yeah, I think these are 2 myths that were probably developed along the same lines of thinking, because what they do is then they create stereotypes that, you know, some people argue that there can be a positive stereotype. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but then then what it does then is it misrepresents the lives and experiences of Asian women and men, and just as the exceptional woman misrepresents or misconceives the idea is that there's only one. And the exceptional model minority suggests that everyone is the same, and so these two intersect, I think, in very interesting ways. And I think that's a very insightful way to think about these two myths.
Cool. Well, those are the only questions I had. Is there anybody else that has any while we're still on here?
I have a question. Are you teaching any courses next semester?
And you mean the fall semester?
Yeah.
I'm on leave in the fall.
Okay.
And so I will not be teaching until the spring of 2022. Probably you all will have graduated by then. But if you're still here, I'm teaching Black Feminist Theory in the spring of 2022.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Anybody else before we wrap up? All right. Well, Dr. Etter-Lewis, we cannot thank you enough for joining us and giving us your time. We so appreciate it. And you have given us so much to think about. And I'm so excited to share this with the rest of the chapter as well.